was in the Masoala district in the national park there, which again is a high biodiversity area, but an important vanilla production region. As you might have heard, Madagascar, as many other islands, closed its borders really early on due to fears of the disease getting into the island and making struggles. This translated into a very important collapse of tourism there. Together with the mobility restrictions, this resulted in an important migration back to the countryside. And these people started reinventing their economical activities towards subsistence agriculture, which again, mining as well, which again increased deforestation, including within the protected areas. So all these 6 case studies, we summarize them in a scheme that I bring you here. And we structured the results from left to right according to effects that were felt more direct, indirect, or spillover effects, and from bottom to top, so those effects and responses that were more local to more global. What we observed was an interlinked cascading disruptions that we're going to look a bit more into detail, that had a series of local responses and feedbacks in land management. Okay, but I will link back to the examples I brought you today. So, relating to the economic disruption and the mobility restrictions, as I said before, this translated into an important local economic crisis. So we have less tourism, less access to markets, and more displaced migration back to the rural areas, right? Which was felt differently according to the land governance and control on border closures, so how relaxed this happened, and more or less control in protected areas. All these processes translated into a new distribution of needs. Maybe we have a pointer there? No. So all these processes translated into a new distribution of needs that we have here, right? With important pressures on land. And I brought you here the examples of increasing forest pressure due to less tourism and less available income, or increased forest pressure due to returning migrants that starting focusing their economic activities on subsistence agriculture. There was also an interesting reorientation of policies that I mentioned before, regarding the more relaxed control of movement of people that had specific activities, such as those workers in agricultural commodity areas. But not all were negative impacts, right? So we referred before to an increase of fauna sightseeings, an improve in digital tools, which allowed some people that live far away from agricultural areas to continue managing their lands or their fields. An improve in remote communication, although this was felt unequally in some regions. This is the last slide. I'm not sure how I'm going with the time, but it should be okay. So we close our work with a reflection that I'm really happy to share with you, and I will be even happier to hear about your experiences there. We were wondering when we close this work if these observed impacts will reflect this differential access to resources at different scales, if these inequalities that had an impact are still felt or not, if these labor migrants that returned to their villages and countryside, did they ever go back to the city or did they stay? And now it's a good moment to start asking us these questions as a review process, right? The same with tourism. Did tourism go back to the areas that were not allowed to go? We were also very curious to understand even more deeper which were the specific attributes that allowed these socio-ecological systems to adapt. So some of them, it was difficult to understand how very weak economies were sustained and maintained, and they made it, and populations persisted. We also saw examples of solidarity between communities, right, existing there. And all this made us wonder whether the actual indicators that we were using to measure health or sustainability or the economy were and are sufficient to characterize these dynamics and these shocks. And with that, there's still 1 more minute, so maybe we can talk a bit about that. Thanks.
Time for questions. Raise your hand if you have a question. Okay.
Interesting talk. I have a question. Also, with COVID came basically a supply shock to many of these systems. Have you experienced in any of these case studies adaptations to supply shock, so that trade patterns changed or something like this, that farmers were no longer accessible to markets they had previously been to?
I'm not sure if I fully heard your question. Adaptation?
Farmers adapted to a supply shock, so that afterwards they were no longer accessible to markets anymore. I don't know, maybe the vanilla producers now, I don't know,
yes,
sources received it from somewhere else.
Thanks. Yes, indeed. So, first of all, farmers could not sell in markets anymore. So, but they were... different people found their ways to continue subsidizing economies or giving back, so selling their product. But specific examples that we use in our work, maybe we have some of the co-authors also here.
And actually, the next talk is going to be talking about Kyrgyzstan and what happened there. It's a very different story than what we typically understand in the north.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious about the role of remittances and how remittances in a lot of places went down. I know there's another talk that's coming up probably about that, but I worked in Guatemala where smallholder families were really hurting for the remittances that they usually depend on from people working in the U.S. So did you look at that and how it affected land systems across all these sites?
We have the remittances expert here, so I'm sorry.
I'm going to say we're going to move on, because the next talk is going to talk a little bit about remittances, and then I'm going to do a much broader perspective on remittances and shocks. And then after that, if you still have questions, you can track me down at lunch. I think we're going to go on to the next talk. Okay, thank you very much, Maria. All right. The next talk is by my colleague, Elizabeth Mack. Oops, got to pull up the right thing here. It is, I'm not sure which is which. I think you'll find out here soon enough. The COVID-19 pandemic and rural livelihoods in Kyrgyzstan. There we go. All right. I will show you at 2 minutes.
Okay, I'm just going to start talking since we're sort of in a flow. All right. So Jeff and I have been working in Kyrgyzstan, and he'll talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing in Romania. Igor, our colleague from Romania, is in the audience, so I just wanted to give a shout out to him as well. But I'm going to focus in this talk on Kyrgyzstan. Looks like we have an interesting aesthetic here going on with the PowerPoint presentation. But the objective is really to understand, given the potential for variation and impact in think of Italy and people living in multifamily units and the health impacts that took place related to the pandemic in Italy versus, what was going on in more rural areas. And then Maria talked about some of the things that were going on in Latin America. So the literature that we're drawing from, of course, deals with issues of rural migration, livelihood strategies, but then also this kind of growing literature about shocks to remittance systems and migration systems and what's going on there. And so I would like to think, and we're finishing the draft of the paper, that this is not just a COVID paper, but it's related to this larger literature on shocks to migration networks and how those networks either adapt, change, and so forth. Okay. So 3 research questions. Very generally, what was going on in rural households in Kyrgyzstan? What factors increased household vulnerability to pandemic impacts? Very widely construed. So we're looking at economic, health, variety of impacts. And then what was going on with some of the remittance dynamics. And Jeff will get into the remittance dynamics, as he said, in another presentation. Okay, I already talked about this, so I'll just kind of skip this slide, but we're drawing on sort of 3 bodies of work here. I don't have a literature review slide because there's not time, but this is a quick nod to all the work that's being done in these 3 areas. Okay, so why Kyrgyzstan? Besides, it's a faraway place to go. It's one of the top 10 countries in the world in terms of reliance on remittances, and it in fact comprises a large percentage of the country's GDP. And so if we're curious, from an economic perspective, what's going on with remittances, and then what might happen from a macro perspective given this linkage to GDP, Kyrgyzstan is a very interesting place to look at. It's also a very mountainous place, so, it's restricted from a mobility standpoint anyway, so you might question whether, to what extent did the mobility restrictions further impact people, or it didn't matter in this country. The majority of the population is rural and they're agro-pastoralists, so livestock management is what most people focus on most of the rural people focus on for their livelihoods. And migration, they're very tied to Russia. So if we're thinking about this larger literature on shocks, Jeff and I wrote a paper earlier where you can clearly show that remittances to this country and other countries that are very closely linked to Russia. Oil shocks in Russia, but also the recent war in the Ukraine, previous invasion of Crimea, those certainly also pose shocks to remittances coming directly from Russia. So Jeff did some work looking at pasture quality, and I headed out into the field with some enumerators, and we knocked on household doors in 2 villages in Atbashi and Naren, and we were able to come up with 427 interviews, and then we had about 30 semi-structured interviews in the first year of field work. We had subsequent years of field work, but this is just from that first year in 2021. Okay, so we had 2 surveys related to the pandemic, specifically on the household survey, and one asked about both health and financial impacts. And then we also asked about household plans to migrate. Were you planning on migrating and could no longer do so because of the pandemic? So I'm going to start with some macro indicators because you can kind of see some clear trends in terms of what's going on from a larger scale perspective, and then how this sort of trickles down at the household scale. So the top left, you can see that there is a definite decline in remittances, and then the decline in remittances continues after into 2023. I have a discussion point at the end, so I'll just put a pin in that and we'll return. Unemployment definitely spikes related to the pandemic, and then you can see shocks to GDP in constant 2015. Okay. You could see a temporary shock to remittances. There's a clear kind of downward trend in the early years of the pandemic. Okay, and now we'll get into some of the other impacts. So the number one impact was reduction in savings. So we see, the overarching theme of the story is that it wasn't so much health impacts in Kyrgyzstan, but there was a series of financial impacts. So if you go down this list here, reduction in savings, an increase in debt, sell livestock means that people had to sell their livestock in order to get money to pay for basic goods and services. But they also had difficulty in doing so because many of the markets were closed. And so their traditional means of getting money when they needed it were not accessible to them. You do see some health impacts related to COVID, family members getting COVID, but the top 3 are certainly related to the finances of individual households. Okay. So our question relating to migration. Most people were not planning on migrating, but you can see some shocks to plans to migrate. So 8% said that they were planning to migrate within Kyrgyzstan as soon as they were able to, and another 10% were planning on going outside of Kyrgyzstan as soon as they could. So those 18% of folks were not able to migrate as initially planned because of the pandemic. So I ran some statistical models to try to understand what are some household characteristics that might have increased the vulnerability of these households to pandemic impacts. And so the number of income sources increased household vulnerability. So these are households that were basically trying to cobble together multiple streams of income to make ends meet. So if you were doing that, then your vulnerability to pandemic impacts increased. Length of residence decreased the likelihood of pandemic impacts, and this might be social ties. The longer you are in a place, you have a social network to reach out to help you deal with some impacts. And certainly this is a big thing in Kyrgyzstan. People said, well, if I have a problem, I simply talk to my neighbors or my extended family, and they loan me money or they help me reconstruct my house or whatever the problem may be. Having more children, some more mouths to feed. Also, there were some education issues that people mentioned as well in the surveys that increased household vulnerability to the pandemic. And then age was close to 1 in a logistic regression, which means almost no effect, but it was a little bit less than that. So we were thinking that maybe pension income decreased older folks' vulnerability to the financial impacts of these related to COVID. Then we also wanted to look at the number of COVID-related impacts. So I had that bar chart at the beginning of the results section that showed all the breakdown of all the different types of impacts that were going on. And so if we look at what increased vulnerability to the likelihood that you'd experience multiple of those impacts, the number of income sources again comes into play. So if you don't have a steady job and you're trying to cobble together money from multiple sources, this enhances your vulnerability. The presence of a migrant. So again, you're trying to get money. You're currently not making enough. So migration is a strategy for getting more household income. That increased the likelihood that you had multiple, not just one, but multiple COVID-related impacts. And then age. Again, we see age decrease the likelihood of having multiple impacts. And again, our idea here was not only pensioner income, but also social connections. So these people might have been living in the community for quite some time. They had a steady income stream that wasn't interrupted by the pandemic, and therefore a lower likelihood of having multiple impacts. Okay, so some discussion items here. In this particular country, the principal impacts of the pandemic were more financial rather than health-related. That's not to say there were no health, but certainly far more financial than health-related. A summary of the main results there: multiple income sources, so people with not steady sources of income, higher likelihood of financial impacts, but also multiple impacts related to education, mobility, etc. The other thing I'll let you kind of read, because it kind of basically repeats some of the things I talked about with regression results. The other thing that's a question in my mind about pandemic-related impacts and remittances that maybe Jeff will speak to a little bit in his presentation is reporting of income. So or reporting of remittances. So if you look at the literature on, was migration activity impacted? For sure. What happened to my remittances? The story is less clear. In my mind, the story might be less clear because people had to resort to formal means of sending remittances. So in some cases, you actually see remittances increase. And the question I have in my mind is this an actual increase, or is this an increase because people were forced to use formal means that are then translated into official accounting of remittance data? So to me, that part is unclear. But certainly they couldn't send money with a person across the border, so then they had to use these formal networks. And so when people say, oh, actually, this is weird, people were restricted from a mobility standpoint, but remittances are increasing, I explain that as the formal documentation that we have of remittances actually went up. So maybe that's controversial. We'll see in the future presentations, and I'll pause for questions. Thank you.
Question.
Oh, you're good. Yeah. Sorry. It's like, I'm done.
Hi. Sorry. Thank you for your presentation. Do you see any long-term impacts in people's household? Because I can imagine that if people were forced to sell their livestock, then that might repercute until these days.
That's a great question. So we actually have survey data from following years that we can actually look at. I haven't actually put everything together, but that would be a way of answering your question. Certainly, the increase in debt potentially could have long-term impacts, but if they were able to sell a lot of livestock, the other story that's coming out of Kyrgyzstan is that people are buying a lot of livestock to bank all this money that's coming in, and so if they're able to sell enough livestock to deal with that debt issue, then the answer would be no.
Yeah, let me just a gloss on that is that when you have lots of sheep, traditionally pastoralist societies use that hoof stock as the banking, much more reliable and much more liquid, and so some people had savings, other people had animals they had purchased with remittances. So in terms of long term, not so much. The biggest impact in Kyrgyzstan was the shutdown, not allowing them to get to the city markets. But everybody had enough food out in the countryside. But Kyrgyzstan has more people living in the countryside than in urban areas. So it's very unusual in that respect.
Thank you so much for your presentation. It was interesting to see that you found with increasing income sources, the vulnerability is increasing, which is sort of a little bit challenging the norm of that more diversity in income would reduce your vulnerability. So do you have any thoughts on that and what's going on there? Could you bin it by income and see, does that change?
Yeah, we could bin by income. The thinking there was that these are people that probably don't have a formal job, so it might be country specific. So in some countries, I have a friend from Nigeria, and they're incredibly entrepreneurial. So if you have multiple sources of income in Nigeria, you're doing very well. But in the Kyrgyz context, I think what's going on is that these were people that weren't formally employed or that lost their job, and so they were trying to sell honey, sell handicrafts. So they were trying to cobble together all these various sources of income. Some of those, the ability to sell products because markets were closed also fell off. So maybe they were doing okay before the pandemic, but the combination of the ability to sell products from various activities kind of fell off, and then this enhanced their vulnerability. Yeah.
Okay, so, sorry, a quick follow-up. So do you think it could be causing them to diversify their income sources as well? The COVID shock or data that we saw? No, or they were already
No, I think they were already diversified, and then the pandemic hit, and they couldn't sell products at market and through traditional means of selling things, and then this hit them very hard.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure.
Great. Let's move on to the next talk. Maybe it can get queued up. All right. So here's my talk. Remittance dynamics as indicators of tele-entanglement. And I will not define what tele-entanglement is, but it is, you can just think of it as a kind of a critique on the concept of telecoupling. Why? Well, let's see. I have lots of co-authors, not only Liz, Lyra, and Sagenbeck from Kyrgyzstan, Mirella, Igor, and Professor Janusz from Romania. This is a combination of lots of different things that we've been doing through the years. And moving forward, down button. All right. So what are remittances? Funds sent by migrants to family and friends back home, and they're a major flow of financial monetary flows, extremely large. The data that we have generated by the World Bank is only a fraction of the flows of remittances because they use the banking system. More broadly, remittances also are not only these personal transfers, but compensation of employees who are in various transnational organizations. And here we have, but fundamentally what we get is people working in urbanized areas sending money to rural areas. So We'll get an overview of global remittance flows in 2022. I'm going to look at the bilateral remittance flows in Kyrgyzstan and Romania in 2021. We're going to talk about systemic shocks. We're going to look at relative sensitivities in Kyrgyzstan, Kyrgyz Republic, Romania, and also in Mexico, since we're here in Mexico, and then conclude. So leveraging this national level remittance data, which was formally produced by the World Bank through the NOMAD group, we're going to look at how the shocks resonate in remittance dynamics. So let's kind of set the stage here. Oh, that's interesting. I wonder why we can't see any of the things. Anyway. Okay. A bunch of countries that send. This is the United States. This is Saudi Arabia. Top receivers, China, Mexico, India. Most reliant. These are countries that their GDP, a very large portion of their GDP, is dependent upon remittances. And these are predominantly mountainous countries and island countries. And then, just to throw in some countries that have a lot of civil strife. Interestingly, in 2022, Kyrgyzstan dropped off this list of the top 10. It was there in 2021, actually it was 2023, that it dropped out because of a drop in GDP. And that was likely associated with Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. So looking at the broadest view here, we have $781 billion moving between 214 different recognized entities. On the receiving side, 189 entities receiving less than 1% of these global flows. 12 entities getting 1 to 2%. They're right there. You see Romania is in there. 6 entities between 2 and 3. 4 to 5%, just 4. Top 3, India, China, and Mexico. Right? That's in the amount of money. Who is sending it? Well, a couple places don't send any. 192 send less than 1%. 8 send 1 to 2%. 4, 2 to 3%. 3, 3 to 4%. 2, 4 to 5%. 1, UAE, 5 to 6%. Saudi Arabia, 6 to 7%. And then we jump the United States. More than 25% of the flows come out of the United States. And nothing in between 7 and 25, which is kind of interesting. Goodness. Okay. Anyway, what you're going to see here, what you should see is lots of little names. But I can tell you that this is just mapping this in greater detail. That's the Russian Federation, which is a very large portion of the flows to Kyrgyzstan, to the Kyrgyz Republic. Comparably, here we have Romania. Now, these 4, which are Spain, Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom, and I am going to later lump these together so we have a comparable comparison with Russia. And those add up to about 70% of the flows to Romania. One of the things you'll see is that Romania receives a lot more in terms of remittances than Kyrgyzstan does from a lot more different places. But things get even interesting. Okay? Kyrgyzstan sends money. There's all sorts of money that is flowing in lots of different directions. We can see here's the top 10 receivers. This is Russia, and then Ukraine, and then Germany, and so on. But there's only 20 places that $228 million go. In contrast, in Romania, $2.3 billion goes to 164 different countries. All right. I'm not even sure what all these are. I think that this is the U.S. These are remittance outflows. This is the combination of Spain and Germany and Italy and the United Kingdom, and this is Russia. And these are net flows, I think. No, they're just outflows. That's what it says on the top. I'm glad that's... All right. Let's look at some shocks. What are the timing of these shocks? And what are we getting in responses? The Great Recession hit everything globally. We can see a decrease in remittances because of economic slowdown. Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, heavy sanctions between 2014 and 2015, significant drop. COVID, different places, different issues, increases in outflows. About flat of those 4 EU countries, increase in the United States, more or less flat here. Russia's second invasion, we see a drop here, not surprisingly. Continued increase here, flat there. If we look at net remittances, and this is China, and this goes from 2000 to 2022. So we see China in terms of net remittances, our zero line is right here. They're going from a net receiver, and they're diminishing down. Russia has been sending lots of money out. Then here's the Great Recession, and then things change. And basically, as we go through, and we can see in the net remittances, those shocks become much more clear. This is the United States here. Ooh, wow. Great. All right. Let's look at sensitivities. Using, here's net flows. This is for Kyrgyzstan. This is Russia outflows and inflows to Kyrgyzstan. This is net migration to Kyrgyzstan. We use this sensitivity analysis. We get something like this. The blue is the outflows from Russia. This is the inflows from this is the inflows to Kyrgyzstan, and we can see the very profound shock that occurs in this sensitivity graphs associated, most importantly, in Kyrgyzstan, the Great Recession. Here we have the same kind of thing happening in Romania. Those are the 4 European countries. Huge increase here. This is like 2012 to 2013 in Romania. Huge spike in net migration. That was from 2022, associated with Russia's second invasion of Ukraine. And then we have this line here is the relative sensitivity of inflows to Romania from the outflows from those 4 countries. And we can see that there's many more changes that are happening. And this is Mexico. Kind of hard. Let's go back one here to see 2 very big spikes happening here in Mexico. This is associated 2002-2003 recession in Mexico that was caused by many things, by 9/11, by economic slowdown associated with China entering the global markets. And then we have this one here associated with, I don't remember, I'm sorry. Anyway, what's going on here? We see every once in a while they were able to produce bilateral matrices. The most recent one is 2021. And to be able to look at inflows and outflows, you need to have things balanced. But we can look at the annual inflows and outflows data. They don't balance, but we can still look at the relative sensitivities, and we can see sensitivities that come from our 3 case studies. Unfortunately, this project is no longer producing data, and no one has stepped up yet to take over the production of the data. And my final caveat, there's a bunch of money that flows through informal value transfer systems that are not captured in the global banking system. And those are throughout the Arab world and in South Asia. So we're only getting a glimpse of the kind of dynamics that are going on. But we see that remittances are highly responsive to major both regional shocks. Oh, I know. I remember that Mexico thing. That was Trump getting elected. Okay? Goodness knows what will happen this time. Anyway, very interesting how these things connect. I've gone overtime. I'm sorry. I won't get any questions. What's that?
Maybe there's time for a question.
Coming through? Okay. My name's Nick Cuba. Partners on this, two of them, Laura Sauls and Jennifer Casolo. Laura's at George Mason. Jen works for Pluriversidad Maya Chorti in Guatemala. I'm coming from Auburn, Montgomery, and then the other little graphic there is for the NASA Land Cover Land Use Change program that funded this work. Let me see, I didn't throw up other little logos. Thank you. It's oriented around a project. I'm going to have to cover a lot of ground so I can kind of pull up the project objectives here, things we started out setting up to do. First is to just derive agricultural land cover metrics related to the landscape composition and configuration and evaluate how they vary with outmigration from Honduras, Salvador, and Guatemala to the U.S. over a period in the last decade. The second was identifying factors that might drive those changes, observable before, within target communities and at different geographic levels. And finally, we were going to look after migration, how the loss of population, but potentially the increase in available capital through remittances might lead to changes in the land systems. This was a project that didn't look at COVID, but was definitely affected by it. I think we applied for it a week before the lockdowns. It came through a few months after, and it kind of held us up. So we didn't do it in this order. The first thing we looked at was, after data processing, was the climate relationships, later on getting to finer scales with the land systems. The first bit we had to do with data processing. The core data set that we had here came from the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. It was the recorded hometown of migrants from these countries apprehended at the southern border between the years 2012 and 2018. So that was a period when the number of migrants from these three countries really started to increase. We didn't have, as maybe anticipated, a clear look after the wave of migration because it simply continued and accelerated after this period. But we took those hometown locations in a table, geolocated them to populated places, caseríos, and aggregated those up to the municipio and department scale on the right and left, respectively. So this, if I talk about migration rate, this is what I'm talking about as kind of the dependent variable, but it's kind of a pseudo quasi rate. It's recorded people who did not cross the border. It's based on population normalization from a satellite product. Here we used WorldPop, which takes into account official census data, but also things like nighttime lights and NTDI. So there's certain regions where this rate was very high, including eastern El Salvador, northwestern Guatemala, and maybe kind of central eastern Honduras. But also kind of in some of the border areas, there are higher values than found elsewhere. So unable to do field work for about 2 years, first derived variables related to the climate variables that related to agricultural livelihood activities, with the hypothesis that people's food security would be adversely impacted by certain changes in climate. So these we used multi-decadal data sets and extracted variables like the timing, the onset of the rainy season, May, June-ish. Total annual rainfall, minimum rainfall during the canicula period, which is during the wet season, a mini dry season. How dry does it really get? How long that is, and then the average daily temperature. And together, these variables related strongly to migration rate at the department scale, so that first level administrative unit, the coarser geography. At the municipio scale, there's no relationship really held up. Just too fine a variation in space of migration rate, whereas the climate data varies over broader scales. But that is an invitation to look at certain regions in more detail, looking at how the land systems changed. Oh, pressing the wrong button. The first one I'll talk about here is in eastern El Salvador. The little blurb mentions Usulután. There are other departments there where similar dynamics prevail. And that's kind of what we use to guide the regional focus, where production systems are similar, maybe anchored around a certain commodity crop. And in this case, it's sugarcane. Two pictures taken kind of ground level here. One shows the, maybe I call it granos básicos, kind of a mix, corn-based, also involving beans, some other plants, on more marginally productive lands, I'd say, with trees interspersed, rocky, hilly. What's taking over has been large-scale sugarcane production. And there's small-scale, too, in this area, but vast fields that you don't really see in any time of other production or any crop type. This is seen, it can be difficult to distinguish some of the smallholder ag from pasture use, other grassland, but the sugarcane stands out. It's irrigated at much, at all or at much higher frequency. It's expansive, it's much greener, and it doesn't have an annual growing cycle. So here we can see some of those large areas. This is an area around Usulután. Data map derived from Sentinel-2 data here for 2020 is shown. And so at this scale, we had some luck relating a proportion of different land cover classes across the municipios in a way that did correspond with the migration rate, the municipio, the finer scale. And in this case, it was a relative measure of the directly observed sugarcane cover and large patches of soil divided by the total of basically any type of agriculture and any type of soil, even small ones. So areas that were, municipios that were totally dominated by sugarcane production had relatively lower migration rates, and those without any had relatively lower. But when there was a mix, a coincidence, those rates were higher. And then, in addition to that land cover based one, another variable that accounts for urban area and population helped to explain that further. This is in a sense a shock, but not during the time scale from which the migration data was sourced. So this is an area that long had commodity crop production, but the commodity was cotton. And the domestic industry, the need for cotton, took a bit hit about 20 years ago with CAFTA free trade affecting El Salvador, but also China, where the industry within the country was gutted, and there was a movement over to large-scale sugarcane. Another region where we've done a lot of work and taken a focus is in the border area between eastern Guatemala and western Honduras. So shown here are three municipios, Hocotan, Camutan, and Copanrinas. Here, there's much more marginal land. There's no large-scale sugarcane production at all. In this place, we've gotten survey data on aspects of livelihood plausibly related to migration. So some of these in Copanrinas were administered by a group called CAS, which is the social arm of the Mennonites there. They're very good. It's kind of an agricultural development organization. In Hocotan and Camutan, Guatemala, this was through our kind of community partners, the Pluriversity Maya Chorti, structured it as an educational endeavor. Now, there's some evidence here that trust provides a barrier that influences our results. So the number of migrants per family in the two Guatemala municipios were an order of magnitude higher than in Honduras. In Guatemala, we had members of indigenous communities as part of the survey teams. They could recognize cases where offered data was not true. We have some information on remittances, and this is shown just for Hocotan, where we have greater abundance of data overall, but also processed. In terms of livelihood, it's dominated by agriculture. In terms of share receiving remittances, it's about a third of households' use of remittance income. Largely basic needs or build a home, but also some are using it for other pathways that might be seen in the landscape, agricultural inputs. Largely, the people receiving remittances said that they were necessary to survive or to kind of marginally improve quality of life. And in terms of when they received it, it's much more recently than when we see it. So in one sense, it's hard to trust any kind of data on remittances on migration because people they have reason to hold that back. They think that it might disqualify them from participation in a program, receiving benefits. And then we've also done a lot more with drones. This can help. At first, I thought it would just help us validate data where there's a lot of crop diversity, but later we can maybe get an insight into aspects of food security like garden production that I didn't really appreciate at the start. So I'll just say thank you and accept questions. One question, but we have lunch after. I'm going to be at the lunch if you want to talk in greater detail. Love to talk. But no questions. Okay.
And our next talk, Matti, Finland, increasing dependency of imported agricultural food production, especially in high-yielding areas. I'll give you the 2-minute warning.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, my talk will be a little bit on different scale and different topics compared to previous ones, but I hope I can still provide some interesting stuff. So basically, I'm trying to summarize a couple of the recent studies we have done on a global scale, looking the agricultural input shocks, their impact on the yields, as well as our dependency on these inputs on a national level. So basically, I'll start with the more kind of I tackle it from two different perspectives: the sustainability, environmental sustainability from planetary boundary perspective, as well as then this dependency of the imports and the recent shocks on the supply chains. Maybe. I think if you there are these 3 dots, I think from there you can get the presentation mode if I'm not mistaken. They're on the top. No. Okay, perfect. Let's start. Okay, so yes, this is just the background. So there are 8 billion people in the world. We have more food per capita than ever. Of course, this has put a lot of pressure on the planet. This is the newest planetary boundary figure showing there is also overlaid with the role of agriculture in these transgressions. on these dotted areas. So you can see that, for example, the biochemical flows, freshwater land system chains, and biodiversity, that food production, agriculture is putting most of the pressure. I will concentrate mostly on the fertilizer use, so the N and P. So if we look at then on the more local scale, so here the positive value means that it's the local planetary boundary is transgressed in these areas, and therefore, if we want to stay within the safe operating space, there's a pressure to decrease the use of nitrogen in this case. So, for example, if you look at these breadbaskets, China, India, US, so they have transgressed quite heavily the nitrogen. So what we wanted to do, we wanted to understand what if we decrease these inputs. So basically then we put together a machine learning model looking, being able to understand, okay, for example, here is the impact of halving the nitrogen input on a global croplands. And so there you can see in some places, for example, in the Central Europe, US, the yields can go down up to 50%. So what we did here, we did this for 12 crops altogether, and so we wanted to really understand what are the input shocks, the potential impact on the yields globally. So this hasn't been done earlier. And what we had an input, we had a gridded, so this is a 10 kilometer resolution globally. So we used different inputs, the fertilizer, machinery, pesticides, and then as well as constant kind of factors, the soil, irrigation, and other things. We did this for 12 crops for each climate bin, and here is a comparison, for example, for wheat compared to the observed national yield. So the model, very simple model, machine learning model, it was able to reproduce the yields very well. So we were confident then to run different scenarios with the model. But before going to that one, there are also these dependencies on in this case, for example, we have done this also for other inputs, but this is the nitrogen. So we mapped globally, so how dependent different countries are from the fertilizers. And the more red, it's basically fully dependent, and then the exporting countries, which are quite few, are then exporters. And here's the trend. So in many areas, with the red one, there is increasing import. So they are increasingly dependent on the inputs to produce the food there. Okay, and then if we go back to shock, so of course there is the need to decrease the use of fertilizers, but there might be also then future shocks on the availability of the fertilizers or pesticides. So that we then look, this is the multiple shock scenario. So basically showing, okay, what if all the inputs, agricultural inputs, would be decreased by 50%. So the what look like, or the yields for wheat in this case, would look like this. So there are heavily impacted areas like the China, parts of US, Central Europe, but then there are less heavily impacted, like my own country, Finland. There are some like Russian areas which are not that actually vulnerable or to this input source. Then if we look all these 12 crops together, looking at, okay, how much altogether production would change if we would shock all these different, all the fertilizers, machinery, and pesticides. Okay, this is of course quite theoretical, but there we see that what we wanted to show here is more kind of where in the world the potential shocks in the inputs would have the highest impact. Of course, this is probably might not happen, but then it gave us a way to understand. Then when combining this together with the dependency from imports, we were able to get this map where basically there we have on the lower left corner there is a very low dependency on imports, and also the potential shock on the yields is very low. So basically here, for example, Russia and a few other places, Norway, they are not that much vulnerable to any shocks, either in the trade or then the needs of decreasing the inputs. But then there are places like France, which are both, they are very dependent on the imports, and they're very much also would be impacted by the potential shocks on the inputs. So basically, what we wanted to also highlight that in these countries there might be a pressure, but there might be a need to re-evaluate. Okay, how dependent we are on the inputs, whether there are other ways of making the agriculture more resilient towards either the need to stay within safe operating space, or then to decrease the kind of the dependency on imports. And especially these highlighted areas, there are like Brazil, France, parts of Southeast Asia, Japan. So might be need to look for more local organic fertilizers, regenerative agricultural practices, diversity in import connections, and so forth, to decrease or increase the resilience. Maybe that's better. Okay. So all in all, this was a little bit maybe the logic was, but more or less this was the kind of a combination of few of the articles where we trying to understand these dependencies on a global trade and impacts on the potential impacts on the yields. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for your talk, Matty. What influence does CO2 fertilisation have on yields in your modelling? Was it considered or not, and what would the sensitivity be of?
Okay, yeah, this was the model, the machine learning model we built up. It was based on the average yields, so we didn't we basically trained it with the gridded yields from spam, and then we validated against national yield. So it's not looking the future, but it's basically based on the observations. So it's not like the future conditions are not there. But I mean, there's a potential to really have it more like a time series based. This was just the first version. Thanks. There was also one.
Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I have a question. Maybe I missed it, but do you treat in any way surpluses, like a nitrogen surplus or pesticide surplus? Because it looked like there's a quite linear relationship between yields and inputs, but also in Europe, for example, we have decreased probably fertilizers by 30%, and the yields have still increased. So I was wondering how you consider the surpluses.
You mean the surpluses? So like in the inputs, accommodated in the. Yeah, we got the same comment from our reviewer. So
it's not the review.
Yeah, but we were not able to take that fully into account. We did include the soil phosphorus kind of what it's like from there's some credit data there globally, and we couldn't fully take that now into account. But I think if we would be able to run it over multiple, now it was just kind of an average over longer period of time, so maybe there would be a need like a way to include that to the model as well. Thanks.
Dependency has a flip side, which is elasticity in response. More developed economies may have higher elasticity. We saw, for example, in your final model, U.S. being extremely dependent on, but those things change, and the range of responses very much depends upon this magnitude of the economy, to be able to bring in alternatives.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, this is a big part. So how basically, if we take these economies into account, of course, the lower economy or lower capacity to adapt to the changes, the more maybe difficult, even though they wouldn't be that vulnerable. Yes, of course, this is something we're also working on. Not like to have this lot of data we are producing socioeconomic, local credit socioeconomic data. Then we can hopefully at some point combine all these things and maybe hopefully take that into account. So thanks.
Great. Thank you. We're going to move on, and our final presentation is by Kushak on whether shocks in major supplying regions influence the price of fruit and vegetable in Canadian cities, and that is a very interesting title slide. So tell us about it.
Hello, everyone.
One more thing. Kushak is a postdoc at UCB.
Thanks, Jeff. I'm just going to keep my laptop here because I'm not sure if my animations are going to work, and if they don't, it's going to be a really challenging presentation. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Today I'll be presenting some exploratory work we did with food prices in assessing how weather shocks, both domestic and cross-border in nature, impact prices in consuming regions, consuming countries. My talks all focuses on Canada, so changing scales from Marty's global work to Canada, but it's also within the Canadian, within the global context. To begin with that context, we live in a globalized world. Thank you. Okay, to begin with some context, we live in a globalized world where a quarter of all our food calories travel across borders. In many ways, this well-organized, globalized food system provides calories for millions of people who live in low per capita agriculture producing regions. In theory, it also offers risk pooling mechanisms by having diversity of producing regions, sourcing regions, and commodities. However, paradoxically, this globalized nature of our food system also exposes people to shocks elsewhere in the world. And despite the globalized nature of our food systems, most national climate risk assessments currently only take a domestic focus, assessing and do not assess risks across borders and how exposed they are to those. Let's take Canada as an example. While it is a net exporter of food because of its massive cereal production and exports, it depends on imports for 80% of its all fruits consumption and 60% of all its vegetable supply. This heavy reliance and not so resilient transportation infrastructure exposes Canada to supply chain vulnerabilities arising from both domestic shocks. Okay, thank you. This is domestic shocks happening within the country, but also cross-border shocks such as extreme droughts happening in California Central Valley that provides significant proportion of food consumed by Canadians. I really need to figure this out. I'm not sure what's happening. Yeah, I've tried both down and up. Okay. So to better understand such vulnerabilities, we asked the question, how do weather shocks in major producing regions influence fruit and vegetable prices in Canadian cities? And to answer this question, I think they're manually changing the slides. We first developed data set that helps us to identify flows of fruits and vegetables from every country in the world and US state to Canadian provinces. We used a mass balance approach using provincial scale production data, bilateral trade data, and also estimates on provincial level consumption. The map here shows aggregated flows of all fruits in blue, all vegetables in flow of all vegetables in orange, and the thickness of the line shows the total flows in quantities. We did this for, I'm sorry, this is us. I think they're doing it manually. We mapped flows for 18 fruits and 16 vegetables over time. Just to show you what the data looks like, this figure here shows flows of avocado or supply of avocados from California and Mexico to British Columbia. And you can see how that changes over time. We've also developed a knowledge mobilization, like interactive dynamic platform to view these flows and understand what's happening with them. And the link to that database is right at the bottom there. Pause again. We then estimated weather shocks at monthly scale across over the global agriculture production regions from 2010 to 2022 using global graded climate data sets. Weather shocks were computed using four agroclimatic weather extremes, ranging a broad range of precipitation and temperature extremes. We also had, for temperature-based extremes, we also had prior expectations in terms of the sensitivity of different fruits and vegetables to the temperature-based weather extremes. These estimates were then combined with our food flow data set to assess where weather shocks were happening and when these shocks were happening. The figure here shows just one example of frequency of monthly shocks in cauliflower and broccoli supplying regions to Canada. We did this for all of the fruits and vegetables in our data set and also 4 different weather extremes. I'm just showing heat stress here. We then, then to quantify the actual impact of these weather shocks on prices, we used an approach called superposed epoch analyses, which is a compositing approach where you line up different price time series to assess what happens when there's a shock and what happens after the shock. Okay, this animation should probably work. So just to give you a brief example of what happens in superposed epoch analyses, we parse 7-month price time series centered around a weather shock, where PT0 represents when a shock happened in a major supplying region, and PT plus 3 represents 3 months after the shock. We line up these price time series and then average them to enhance the signal and remove any noise that might be there. We do this with all price shocks, weather shocks that we see in our supply chain data. And then we call this shock composite, which is basically giving us an average impact of weather shocks on prices. To ensure that this is not a randomly generated signal, we compared our shock analyses with 1,000 pseudo-shock composites. This figure here shows one example of our results. This is showing the impact of, on average, impact of heat stress on lettuce prices in Canadian cities. And the 1.36 shows that on average, lettuce prices increase by 36% every time there was on average when there was heat stress shocks happening in supplying regions. The box plot here shows our pseudo-shock distribution of pseudo-shocks, and the distance from the box plot and the line shows if it's significant or not. Normally, we would expect prices to increase after weather shocks, but this was not always the case. It's gone way ahead. Back again, please. Normally, you would expect prices to increase, but we also saw prices would decrease decreasing after weather shocks. For example, in case of apples, we found that prices decreased by on average 8% after heat stress. It was really interesting to understand why this was happening. Like humans, apples also experience heat stress, and that impacts the quality of apple production, causing the quality of the apple production to go down, apple supply to go down. Which within the Canadian context, based on our interviews that we conducted, one interview we conducted with a wholesaler, we understood that there are different supply chain dynamics happening in high-income countries like Canada. In case of our fruit and vegetable example, supermarkets were procuring large quantities of produce on contracts. These supermarkets then reject a lot of produce if the quality does not make sense to them, it's not up to the mark, and that produce is rejected at when the produce is at the gate, which is rejected and then procured by wholesalers and sold on smaller mom and pop stores, causing the prices to decline after weather shocks. So the key findings from this research was that using the weather shock data and some new novel supply chain data that we created, we found that Canada experienced a lot of weather shocks, and most of them were cross-border in nature. We also found that the weather signal is reflected in prices. As this quote from the wholesaler sort of portrays, the wholesaler said there is a direct link between growing region weather to wholesale prices. I can tell you it is pretty integrated. You will see prices going through one way or the other. That's what our data is also sort of showing. Lastly, we also found that the prices are extremely complex. There's a lot of different dynamics influencing prices. Weather is not the only one, and that we require more commodity-specific investigation to better understand what's going on and how weather shocks are impacting food prices. Overall, the implication of our work, it has a few different implications. First is that there is a need for a more systemic perspective to assess climate shocks, to assess and build food system resilience, which, as the National Climate Risk Assessments show, we are lacking right now. Not a lot of countries take a systemic perspective. Second, that most climate finance right now focus on mitigation programs. In Canada, majority of the funding that goes through climate finance is focused on mitigation and not adaptation. Some of the findings from our research shows that it would be beneficial for high-income countries to also invest in adaptation programs rather than just focusing on mitigation programs across borders, especially in low-middle income countries. And that as weather shocks and other shocks increase in our system, we need more ambitious policies and not just let market basically help in price shocks. And with that, I think I'm early. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. I'm sorry about the animation and.
Hi, thanks. That was really, really interesting. Quick clarification and question. How did you define climate shock? Like, what size of weather event are we talking about? And could you use your method then to project forward in terms of price impacts under future climate change?
Thank you so much. So to define weather shock, we basically use Z-scores or normalized anomalies, looking at historical weather indices. So we use 4 weather extremes. One is TX 35, number of days above 35 degrees Celsius, for example, during growing season. And to assess the shock, we looked at what the Z-score value was for a particular month compared to a 30-year average in the past. And regarding future projections, no, this is more of a historical sort of approach. You can just see on observation data. But we are thinking and talking about doing more predictive modeling using similar data sets. That would probably offer us more future prediction potential. Thank you.
Hi, great presentation. I appreciated the focus on Canada and on BC, and it made me curious how easily replicable this shock analysis would be to other geographies, and if you think that would be possible then to extrapolate broader trends based on certain commodities and how heat stress might affect those.
Thank you for that question. That's a great question. So I think the major issue in general is supply chain data. There's limited. If we can do this at a national level, it's going to be pretty easy. We have data on national sort of where food is grown, where the shocks are happening, and the bilateral trade data. For more like higher resolution, we still lack. Trace from SEI have developed some data sets, and there are a few other data sets to do that. But again, there's only a few people working on like developing those data sets. I know there's some for the US. We have like county level data on food flows. That would be a really interesting study to look at too.
Thanks.
That.
Maybe this is getting a little too granular, but did you look at the effective heat stress depending on the cycle that the crop is in? Because during vegetative growth, it could be very different heat impact versus during reproductive growth of the crop.
That's a great question. I got that question like a gazillion times from my PhD committee. There was a trade-off between looking at so many fruit and vegetables versus delving more deeper into each of the specific fruits and vegetables. So we made the trade-off of keeping it more general right now, just as the first cut. A more commodity-specific analyses, I think, would have to incorporate those growing cycles and looking at those. But the challenge would also be then you need to assess the growing season cycles across the world for these fruit and vegetables, which we don't have a great sense of right now. And it would vary by region as well. This is great. I'm glad I finished early.
Just a quick one. I think 1 or 2 years ago I came across some news that Canada is increasingly producing fruits indoors. Is that already a reaction to these kind of shocks or something like this?
So yeah, there's been a push to increase more greenhouse production, also vertical farming. I think the people who are proponents of technology-focused production, they're doing that. What it does is, with the increase in prices, it becomes more economically feasible for those high price production. So that's happening. I don't know what the actual quantities are produced right now, but yeah, we're seeing more of those greenhouses come in vertical farming as well. I think hand in hand, I would think, as we're seeing the markets react that way, people are investing more, and then the governments are acting as well, creating more sort of enabling environments.
Yes, one final question.
You don't get back.
Because in line with our theme is having access to Canada year-round sustainable? Is it not?
Honestly, I've stopped eating bananas in Canada because they taste gross. So, in my opinion, it's not just. In some way, it's complex. There's a lot of consolidation in banana industry. There's 4 part companies that are producing and supplying all of bananas. So I don't think that's just. I also don't think it's just that. I don't know what the ground reality is, how much farmers are benefiting from that. If they're not, then I think we just need to eat more seasonal in any which way. Eating more seasonal food and what's locally produced is always the better alternative.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for attending a very interesting session. It's time to go to lunch. Anybody who's interested in, we have a group meeting on remittance dynamics and land change, part of the GLP working group. We will be clustered somewhere once we find out in the food area. So join us if you're interested. Thank you.